Hello and welcome to part 2 of the development of French interwar bombers. This is a direct continuation from part 1, I'm not going to be doing a boring recap, so if you haven't watched part 1 yet, I advise you to do so now, otherwise this video probably won't make a lot of sense, you have been warned. Now, for this second part of our discussion on French interwar bombers, I'm taking almost an opposite approach to what I did with part 1. Part 1 focused quite heavily on specific aircraft designs, while briefly exploring French Air Force policies and doctrine. Today, we're going to have to explore the policies of the French Air Force, and the politics of the French government, in a bit more detail, as understanding them is critical to understanding why French bomber development went the way it did in the 1930s. That being said, I have done my best to keep things as concise as possible, otherwise this part of the video would probably go on for about 4 to 6 hours. In a broad nutshell, the 30s were a chaotic mess that made the 1920s seem tame in comparison. The second decade of the interwar period would see old ideas renewed, existing ideas questioned, and a smaller but more varied generation of bombing aircraft take to the sky. Some of them were excellent, and some of them really weren't. So let's continue. By the beginning of the 1930s, it already appeared to some that the idea of the multi-purpose combat plane, known in France as the BCR or Battle Combat Reconnaissance Plane, wasn't going to work out. Indeed, the underperforming and visually distressing machines that had emerged thus far could only be described as a massive cock-up on the part of the French Air Ministry. This was beginning to cause no small amount of backroom squabbling between the French government, the French army, and the French Air Force. In particular, relations between the army and the Air Force had soured extremely between 1928 and 1930. This is an important point to discuss, as it both relates to the development of French bombing aircraft, but also to that of French Air Ministry policy, which, in the 1930s, would make a series of fatal blunders. By the early 30s, the French bombing fleet was no longer of secondary importance, and was now considered vital to the defence of France in the event of a war. The writings of bomber enthusiasts such as Julio Duhay had had a significant impact on both the public and the government mind, and bomber aircraft were now viewed as a feared weapon, threatening cities with destruction in a single night, and many believed that a nation with a big bomber force was far less likely to be suddenly attacked by its neighbours. Most of France's bomber force, along with a few fighter squadrons, was now concentrated in a group known as the General Reserve. This bombing deterrent force was under the control of the government, not the army, and this allowed the Air Ministry, and thus the Air Force, to influence how the General Reserve was equipped and managed. This was why, even though the Air Force was subservient to the army, the government had approved the idea of the BCR aircraft. Mostly because it solved a major problem, at least on paper. Government did not have the funds to both build a bombing fleet and also provide the army with aircraft for observation, reconnaissance, and tactical support. So, why not combine everything into a single package? On paper, the concept certainly had merit. A multi-engine, multi-seat aircraft could be designed to fulfill a number of roles, which, in theory, made it very good value for money. It could be a bomber, a heavy fighter, a reconnaissance aircraft, a liaison aircraft, or even just a transport. It would reduce the number of aircraft types which the Air Force would have to field, which theoretically made things easier for the French aero industry, as many aircraft would share common parts. And, importantly, it would allow the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy more flexibility when it came to the allocation of airframes and resources. It would mean that in a future hypothetical war, machines could be taken from one service and given to another if the need arose, and there would be minimal changes required to refit the aircraft from, say, the role of that of being a reconnaissance aircraft to that of a medium or a long-range bomber. But, so far, the execution of this concept had been a complete disaster. By the end of 1932, only one design had even come close to meeting the Air Ministry's expectations, the Amiot 140, and even then it was only considered the least disappointing of a particularly disappointing group. Though it met some of the Ministry's requirements, too much emphasis had been placed on the bombing role, and while it was a fairly decent bomber to its credit, and while it could be just passable as a reconnaissance aircraft, the thought of using it as a heavy escort or bomber interceptor was downright laughable. The disastrous results of the BCR program put the army in a prime position to regain tighter control of the French Air Force, with many people calling for the bungling Air Ministry to be dissolved. Many officers believed that the potential of the bomber aircraft was being exaggerated, and, by extension, that of the Air Force as well. Aircraft on their own could never win a war, but they might help win a war by supporting the army on the ground, not bombing civilians hundreds of miles behind the front lines. The army demanded that the Air Ministry abandon what was clearly a failed experiment, and focus more of its time and resources on developing aircraft that were actually useful, armed reconnaissance aircraft for the army, and fighter aircraft to protect them. But timing wasn't on the army's side. Several events were about to unfold which would lead to a renewed and enthusiastic interest in the BCR concept, and, even worse, they would reinforce the belief that the main goal of the French Air Force should be to field a powerful strategic bombing fleet. The biggest event which influenced French Air Force policy, and which led to a renewed interest in the BCR concept, occurred across the border in Germany. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler rose to power, and over the next 2 years, as he consolidated his position, the French grimly realized that the potential threat of a German air force from the 1920s had now become very real. Although the existence of the German Luftwaffe was not officially announced until March of 1935, it soon became an open secret that the German aero industry was rapidly expanding. This was a cause for alarm, as while the German aircraft industry was expanding, the French industry had gone through a period of serious contraction. By 1934, the number of military aircraft built in France was just 1/3 of its peak in the previous decade. Though part of this was due to the struggling French economy, the biggest problem was a lack of determined government policy. No large production orders for any type of aircraft had been placed since the mid-1920s. Factories were underutilized, and some had ceased operating altogether. France's bombing force was still expanding despite this, but it was predicted that the Germans would significantly outpace it. It was estimated that by 1936, the Luftwaffe could be capable of dropping 1,500 tons of bombs on Paris in a single raid, while the French Air Force would barely manage to drop 250 tons on Berlin in reply. These predictions, though they would later prove to be excessive, spurred a renewed interest in the expansion of the French bombing force. This just happened to coincide with a change of leadership within the French Air Ministry, and combined, they would have a major impact on French aerial doctrine over the next few years. At the end of January 1933, a new French government came into power, and Pierre Cot replaced Paul Painlevé as the French Air Minister. This was significant, as the two men had very different approaches to the use of air power. As a long-standing supporter of aviation, Painlevé appreciated the potential power of aerial bombing, but he was also a man who had not wished to see the horrors of the First World War repeated. His brief tenure as Air Minister saw him attempt to de-escalate the power of aircraft. Like many, he feared what a future war might bring. He supported proposals for a treaty that banned the production of bomber aircraft altogether, and he was among those who called for a peacekeeping international air force to be controlled by the League of Nations. Though these notions were somewhat optimistic and rosy, and could easily paint Painlevé as a pacifist, he was not stupid. In his previous role as a war minister, he had been responsible for most of the major design work of the famous Maginot Line, and although he supported the proposed banning of bombing aircraft, he also supported the continued development of the BCR aircraft that were established by his predecessors. Painlevé was a seasoned politician. He was a gifted mathematician, and he was smart enough to realise that French success in a future war would depend on good cooperation between land and air units. But he was also something of a traditionalist, and because of this, he expected that a future war with Germany would probably play out along a similar and slow trajectory as the first. So long as the army, supported by air units, could keep the Germans at bay, they would gradually grind them down. Now, in contrast, Painlevé's successor, the youthful, ambitious Pierre Cot, was far more pessimistic in his predictions for a future war with Germany. Cot feared that a resurgent and revenge-seeking Germany might choose to deliver a knockout blow when no immediate cause for conflict seemed to exist, and he feared that this would come in the form of a new German air force. In response to this new threat, he drew up a plan for how the French Air Force should be organised. At all times, all available fighter aircraft, including those belonging to the army, had to be ready to intercept incoming attacks from Germany's bomber fleet. Simultaneously, all aircraft capable of carrying bombs had to be equally ready for an immediate counterattack. Cot also wanted all army reconnaissance and observation squadrons to be equipped with aircraft capable of bombing as well, to further bolster France's offensive strength. This plan would result in a large expansion of France's bombing fleet, and its air force in general, which on its own was viewed by many as a very radical proposal. But Cot went even further. He argued that for this strategy to be effective, all aerial units would have to serve under a single commander, a single air force, independent from army control. His proposals were reviewed by a government committee in March of 1933, and his arguments carried weight. A unified and offensively minded air force was vital because the army was adopting such a static and defensive strategy. The army's plan, should war break out with Germany, was to defend against the initial attack and sap Germany's strength in a war of attrition. Germany would be gradually strangled by blockade, and then, with its enemy weakened, the French army would begin an offensive campaign. Cot argued that this was an outdated strategy that didn't take into account the growing capabilities of air power, and that Germany could attack France with a powerful aerial assault before war had even been formally declared. He also argued that army mobilizations took time. A powerful Luftwaffe could simultaneously strike French air bases and army logistic points at the beginning of a war, crippling France's ability to fight back. After this initial attack, Germany would then turn to France's cities, bombing them indiscriminately, reducing its industrial capacity, and breaking the people's will to carry on the war. His plan and arguments were not without opposition, sometimes very strong opposition from within the War Ministry, but time, or rather a lack of time, was on Pierre Cot's side. It was evident that Germany would rearm sooner rather than later, and if France wanted to maintain its military advantage, it had to field a strong and powerful air force. And this is when the BCR concept received a new boost in support. Pierre Cot demanded a strong increase to the French bombing fleet for the inevitable air war. The army demanded new observation and reconnaissance aircraft for the inevitable land war. The French economy, reeling from the Great Depression, could not afford the mass production of both. Once again, the solution to the apparently conflicting requirements of the Air Force and Army appeared to be the multi-purpose combat plane. And it just so happened that Pierre Cot was a staunch supporter of this concept. The BCR plane was his trump card, his winning argument against the oppositions of the army, an army who feared that an independent air force, obsessed with a Douhet-style aerial struggle, would deny them the tactical aircraft they required. Now, that is obviously a very oversimplified version of events, as an in-depth description of this would take hours, and because of that I will be equally as brief with the results that followed. Bowing to government pressure, the Army and Navy did agree to the creation of an independent air force, but only on the condition that they would decide which of their air squadrons would be given over to the General Reserve. The rest would remain under their own control. Though this meant that the Air Ministry didn't have full control over all of France's aerial forces, it did control a majority, And more importantly, the Air Ministry now had full control over what aircraft were to be designed for the Air Force. The Army's old influence was all but gone. Pierre Cot was now faced with a challenge. In 1933, the Air Ministry drew up Plan 1, which was a template for the reorganisation of France's air units. It relied heavily on the use of BCR aircraft, which would eventually equip more than half of the entire French Air Force, and it was a plan that also relied heavily on quality over quantity. As a multi-purpose aircraft was more expensive to produce than a traditional army reconnaissance plane or a single fighter, the total number of aircraft fielded by France, and the army in particular, would have to be reduced, going from a strength of 1,400 in 1933 to a planned strength of just over 1,000 by 1938. The fighter force would be reduced by nearly a third, the bombing force would be slightly increased, and the number of dedicated reconnaissance squadrons would be cut in half. The Air Ministry argued that the reduced numbers would be compensated by the superior versatility of the BCR plane, but, surprisingly, nobody in the army was at all convinced, as so far the BCR program was shaping up to be a complete disaster. Indeed, the mediocrity of the first generation of BCR aircraft was appreciated by all, Pierre Cot included, and he decreed that designers would need to start again. In the meantime, steps would be taken to improve the current designs to try and make them a bit more useful. This led to the aforementioned Amiot 143, which we discussed earlier. In June 1933, the Air Ministry issued a new specification for a battle combat reconnaissance plane. Whereas the previous 1928 specification was vague in its requirements, this new one outlined a list of very clear, and sometimes conflicting, requirements. The Air Ministry required an ultra-modern, twin-engine aircraft that was as fast as any contemporary fighter currently in service. It was to be well armed by a powerful array of defensive turrets, and it was to have a top speed of no less than 350 km per hour. It was hoped that the arrival of more powerful engines, like the 900 horsepower Gnome Mistral Major and the improved Hispano-Suiza V12s, would give these new BCR aircraft the performance that the first generation lacked. This would in theory completely remove the need for escort fighters, as these new aircraft would either completely outrun or completely outgun their opponents. In terms of versatility, a successful design would have to fulfill the following roles: artillery observation, tactical reconnaissance and tactical bombing, strategic reconnaissance and strategic bombing, long-range bomber escort for France's dedicated heavy bomber fleet, and home defense bomber interception. Now, given the problems French designers had in making the previous generation of BCR planes useful for performing even a single one of these roles, the Air Ministry was remarkably confident that such a design was even possible. Those that championed the concept of the BCR plane, like Pierre Cot himself, claimed that France would soon have the most modern and versatile air force in Europe, capable of responding immediately to a wide range of military threats. But, as it turned out, this wouldn't be further from the truth. The specification was asking for a lot. In fact, it was asking for the impossible. It was expecting a single aircraft type to perform virtually every military role an aircraft could perform. The army reacted to this specification with dismay, claiming such a machine was totally unsuitable to their needs when compared to the more specialized types being designed for their own units. Some officers also claimed that the BCR concept was just a sneaky way for the French Air Force to field as many bombers as physically possible, and indeed, they were correct on both points. The Air Ministry's growing obsession with a Duhay-style aerial war was sending the Air Force down a dangerous path. Whereas in the 1920s, the Army had undervalued the bomber, the Air Force now overestimated its importance. In its quest to field as many bombers as possible, the Air Ministry was now reducing the Air Force's total strength, and it was basing this on theories and design concepts that had yet to be even proven. Now, in the French Air Ministry's defense, the idea of using a twin-engine aircraft for multiple roles was not far-fetched, nor was it impossible. Later on, during the Second World War, several aircraft of this type were used successfully, and I'd say one of the best examples would have been the de Havilland Mosquito. But, and this is a very big, curvaceous but, the Mosquito was built with compromise, whereas the French Air Ministry were totally uncompromising in their requirements. 1933 to 1935 was a critical time in aircraft development, where new power plants could be combined with new construction methods to produce highly streamlined aircraft with incredible top speeds. However, the French Air Ministry insisted on the BCR aircraft being self-defending, to remove the need for escorts, and this meant equipping them with heavy, drag-inducing turrets. And so, while their neighbours in Britain, Germany and Italy were exploiting the power of their new engines to achieve record-breaking speeds, the French were using that same power to lift a bulky, cumbersome design into the air at barely average speeds. Yeah, this really wasn't going to end well, was it? Despite asking for the impossible, the French Air Ministry received several design submissions from the French aircraft industry, mostly because they were desperate for work, and for once the Air Ministry seemed to be promising some large contracts. 5 designs would emerge from the new BCR specification, 4 official submissions, and a 5th unofficial contender. The 4 official designs consisted of the Amiot 144, aka the Amiot 143 version 2 electric boogaloo. Then there was the Breguet 460, which really did look like a weaponized greenhouse that had taken flight. Then there was the Farman F.420, which looked like a scaled-down version of their F.222 heavy bomber. And then there was the Bloch MB.130, which had the aerodynamics of a brick. The 5th unofficial contender would be the Potez 54, or, as I like to call it, the mistake, the reasons for which we will get into shortly. The commencement of this new BCR program was the opening act to a dramatic and chaotic 4-year period, spanning 1933 to the end of 1937, which almost played out like a Shakespearean tragedy. 5 aircraft, all alike in mediocrity, in fair France where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where the Air Force and the Army bicker like a pair of blithering idiots, thus compromising their national defence. Look, Shakespeare did it better, but you get the point. Considering that Pierre Cot and the Air Ministry were practically frothing at the mouth to get the BCR program underway, it might come as a surprise to some that the concept would all but disappear by the end of 1934. Within the span of 18 months, the entire idea was completely blown out of the water, and this left the French Air Ministry scrambling for a replacement, only to stumble into yet another critical mistake. Several things brought the BCR program crashing down, and yet, despite being exposed as a failed concept, these aircraft would still enter service in large numbers. The latter point is actually directly related to the former, and because of that, we'll explore why the BCR program failed first, and then look at the aircraft that were born from it. Some claim that a lot of things led to the downfall of the BCR concept, a metaphorical death by 1,000 cuts, as it were. But from my own research, I found that it was more like a death from 3 crude hatchet blows in the dark of the night, and each one of them a fatal wound. The first blow was the emergence of the cannon as a practicable air-to-air weapon. Early French attempts to use cannons had been disappointing. They had a very potent recoil and a low rate of fire. Mounting them on small fighters was difficult, and using them to convert bombers into large gun carriers had proven ineffective. However, in the early 30s, Hispano-Suiza had acquired the rights to produce the 20mm Oerlikon S. This was an excellent gun, which managed an impressive fire rate of 300 rounds per minute, and Hispano-Suiza were then able to improve upon this design, eventually producing cannons which could fire 400 rounds per minute, then 600, then 700. Hispano-Suiza then built a new engine around this cannon, as the engine was the strongest part of a plane, and thus the best thing to absorb the gun's recoil, and this resulted in the Hispano-Suiza 12Y. In 1932 and 1933, the Air Ministry drew up specifications for fighter aircraft to make use of this new weapon, and plans were also drawn up for a twin-engine bomber interceptor that made use of 2 of these cannons as well. As this cannon could send 4 times the weight of metal downrange, at a further range, and with the addition of explosive filler compared to traditional machine guns, it represented a significant increase in fighter aircraft lethality. If France was taking advantage of this new weapon, it made sense that other nations would do so as well. The BCR aircraft relied on machine guns for defense, but these would now be outranged by cannon-armed fighters, making their defense useless. The only solution was to equip them with cannons for defense as well, but this presented a significant challenge. New gun turrets would have to be designed, as the current models could not hope to cope with the recoil of the 20mm cannon. These would not only be larger, thus creating more drag, but also heavier, much heavier. Even with the latest power plants available, a cannon-armed BCR plane couldn't possibly hope to achieve more than 320 km an hour, and even that was an optimistic estimate. Along with this realization, another blow to the BCR program was the emergence of superior designs overseas. In the United States, the Martin B-10 was beginning to enter service. This was a bomber that had the same top speed as the planned BCR aircraft, despite having significantly weaker engines. Even more worrying was the rapid development being made with fighter aircraft. The Boeing P-26, which first flew in 1932, had a higher top speed than the planned BCR plane, as did the emerging Soviet Polikarpov I-16. Closer to home, both Britain and Germany had made huge advancements in power plant design that promised significantly improved fighters in the not-too-distant future. This would force the French Air Ministry to prioritise the development of faster aircraft, and this meant ditching the BCR planes and their cumbersome drag-inducing turrets. The third and biggest blow to the BCR program came with a change in government, one of many that occurred during what was becoming a very tumultuous decade for French politics. In February 1934, riots forced the sitting government to resign, and with this, Pierre Cot lost his place as Air Minister. Departing with him were several other staunch supporters of the BCR concept, and this allowed new minds and new ideas to move into the heart of the French Air Ministry. At least for the time being, as this would, unfortunately, not be the last we would hear of Pierre Cot. Cot was replaced by General Victor Denard. A veteran pilot of the First World War, Denard had served under Cot as Chief of the Air Force General Staff, and while he too was a strong supporter of the BCR concept, he was not stubborn enough to ignore its critics. In October 1934, he received a detailed report on the current state of the French Air Force, and the condition of the General Reserve, the great bombing fleet that was meant to be France's aerial sword and shield, and what he read did not fill him with confidence. Some bombing squadrons still fielded the completely obsolete LeO 20 biplane, and its replacement, the Bloch MB.130, was already being outclassed by new designs emerging in Germany. The development of heavy bombers had yielded just one viable design, the Farman F.420 and its derivatives, and the planned BCR planes were already having their performance surpassed by designs overseas, like the Martin B-10. The report bluntly stated that the French bombing fleet had become inferior to both its allies and potential enemies, and that drastic action would be needed to rectify the situation. It recommended that bombers should either be lightly armed, with no drag-inducing turrets, or if turrets were absolutely required, they should be retractable and only installed in the dorsal and ventral positions. In either case, there should be no nose turret, as that was found to have the worst impact on aerodynamics. The emphasis should be on achieving the most streamlined plane with the highest possible top speed. With the engines available at the time, the report concluded that there was no reason why a bomber with a powerful defensive armament, based on retractable cannon-armed turrets, should not be capable of achieving 400 km an hour and have sufficient range to bomb targets in both Germany and Italy. Denard took the advice seriously. Given how entrenched the BCR concept had become, it was abandoned with remarkable speed as the Air Ministry changed course under its new steward. When Denard proposed his replacement for Pierre Cotte's Plan 1, with a new reorganization of the Air Force, it included the requirement for 300 examples of a new fast bomber, a 5-man aircraft with a minimum top speed of 400 km an hour and a bomb load of at least 1.5 tons. Denard's plan also included 115 observation aircraft for the Army, much to their internal relief, plus an additional 115 armed reconnaissance bombers, and the fighter force was almost doubled from Cotte's dramatic reductions. All of these new types of aircraft, and several others which were entering the pipeline, were planned to enter service between 1936 and 1938. In the meantime, the Air Ministry decided that it would continue with the BCR aircraft as a stopgap measure. Though flawed, they were still superior to France's existing fleet of aged designs. That being said, the Air Ministry wasn't stupid enough to consider them for use in such roles as that of a heavy fighter, for example, and the BCR planes would be chiefly concerned with bombing and reconnaissance, with tactical support of the Army as a secondary objective. With that in mind, we'll take a look at the BCR planes now, and then we'll explore why this planned stopgap measure turned into something a little more permanent. Out of these 5 designs, only 2 would eventually go into large-scale production, albeit one of those in a heavily modified state. So we'll look at the 3 failed prototypes first. Firstly, we have the Amiot 144. This was simply an updated version of what became the Amiot 143. It was equipped with 890 horsepower Gnome Mistral Major engines, which drove new 3-blade variable pitch propellers. It had a redesigned wing, which included flaps for takeoff and landing, and it featured a new retractable undercarriage. Its bomb capacity remained the same as the Amiot 143, 1.6 tons, but thanks to its moderately sleeker design, it was capable of achieving 350 km an hour at an altitude of 4,000 meters. The 144 made its first flight on January 18, 1936, and in subsequent trials it demonstrated good handling characteristics and an improved range of 2,000 kilometers. A small number were then ordered for service testing, followed with a small production order, but then it was decided that the improvements found in the 144 did not justify the sharp increase in cost, and instead the Air Ministry decided to bump up its existing order for the older Amiot 143. The Farman F.420 also missed out on a production order, but unlike the Amiot 144, which had some redeeming qualities, this aircraft was a total failure. The prototype was completed towards the end of spring in 1934, and it made its first flight on June the 18th. Built as a high-wing cantilever monoplane, there was a subtle resemblance between it and the larger Farman F.420 heavy bomber. Now, this design was conceived and reviewed before Denard initiated his new plan for the Air Force, and as such, the F.420 maintained a bulky and very unclean design. It had a crew of 3, a wingspan of 22 meters, a length of 14.5 meters, and a loaded weight of approximately 6.9 tons. It was equipped with at least 3 defensive machine guns, 1 in the nose, and at least 1 in the dorsal and ventral positions, and its internal bomb bay could manage a payload of up to 1,400 kilos. It did come with a retractable undercarriage, but other than that and the use of streamlined cowlings, it did not represent a very aerodynamic profile. Nevertheless, in flight trials, it also achieved the required top speed of 350 km an hour, but it only managed half the operational range of the Amiot. Then there was also the little matter of it becoming a flying death trap. On just its second flight, the prototype would crash fatally. The wing of the 420 was built from wood, and the engine exhaust pipes, which ran over the wing, were not properly insulated. During the flight, the wing caught fire, and the flames quickly spread towards the fuselage. The 2 crew members, André Salel and Roger Robin, attempted to bail out, only to find that the side door in the fuselage was too narrow for them to escape whilst wearing parachute packs, and both died in the subsequent crash. A second 420 prototype would be hastily completed, with a modified exhaust and a larger escape hatch, but it failed to impress officials when it was trialled in 1935, and this aircraft would eventually be scrapped at some point between 1935 and 1937. Now, despite looking like a shrunken, equally ugly, and somehow more aerodynamically challenged version of the Bloch MB.200, the MB.130 would quickly evolve and go on to achieve something that vaguely resembled success. Like the Farman F.420, this design was conceived before the BCR concept had been dismissed, and as such, the MB.130 possessed the same charming qualities as its forebears: appalling looks, mediocre speed, and a distinct lack of direction. Like the MB.200, it was vaguely innovative in that it was completed as an all-metal cantilever monoplane, but the fixed undercarriage, albeit enclosed in aerodynamic fairings, gave it a dated and clumsy appearance. The MB.130 came with a crew of 3, a pilot, a navigator/bomb aimer, and a dedicated defensive gunner. Its firepower was modest. It was defended by 3 7.5mm machine guns, one in the nose and one each in the dorsal and ventral position, and the bomb load was just 800 kilos. It had a wingspan of 18.9 meters, a length of 15.6 meters, and it had a loaded weight of 6.5 tons. Powered by 760 horsepower radial engines, the 130 was the weakest of the designs submitted for the Air Ministry's approval. Flying for the first time on June 8, 1934, it could barely manage a top speed of 340 km an hour, 10 km an hour slower than the competition and the requirement. However, the crash of the Farman prototype, and delays at Amiot, bought Marcel Bloch a reprieve, allowing his design team to improve the 130 into the 130B. This updated prototype had more powerful engines of 870 horsepower, a retractable undercarriage, and an improved dorsal turret. Performance only increased marginally, but it was enough to earn the type a production order for 40 aircraft. But the ink was barely dry on the contract before the 130B was abandoned. Bloch's design team realized that the BCR concept wasn't going to work out, and instead of waiting for the inevitable cancellation of their order, they took a gamble and redesigned their aircraft into a light reconnaissance bomber. The result was the much improved MB.131, and for the first time in a long time, the French Air Force was on the cusp of having a bomber that didn't look half bad. The 130's corrugated skin was replaced by smooth riveted sheet metal, the front of the fuselage was redesigned and streamlined, the wing was now low-mounted and of an improved shape, and the power plant was now capable of providing 900 horsepower at an altitude of 4,000 meters. This design was submitted to the Air Ministry at the start of 1936, and it was promising enough for them to make the very rare move, at least in France, of ordering the type straight from the drawing board, long before the prototype was due to fly. The existing order for 40 MB.130s was then converted to the MB.131s, and further orders would soon follow. Now, as the MB.131 was a dedicated reconnaissance bomber, and not a BCR aircraft, we'll put it aside for the moment and focus on the remaining 2 designs that were related to the 1933 BCR specification, and come back to the MB.131 later. The last of the 4 official submissions sent to the Air Ministry was the Breguet 460, which in some ways could be considered a huge missed opportunity for the French Air Force. The 460 was a much improved version of the visually offensive Breguet 410 and its derivatives. Though it was originally conceived as an improved BCR plane, the 460 would eventually be submitted towards the Air Ministry's high-speed bomber requirement as well. Somewhat modern in its appearance, at least compared to its predecessor, it featured a new monoplane wing, a heavily redesigned front fuselage, 800 horsepower Mistral Major radial engines, a new retractable undercarriage, and a lighter but stronger internal framework. The gross weight did increase to 8,200 kilograms, but this was mostly due to the bomb load being increased, going from 1,000 to 1,500 kilos. Additionally, the range had improved significantly, going up to 2,000 kilometers, and the aircraft was expected to have a top speed in excess of 400 kilometers per hour. The Breguet 460 flew for the first time in early 1935. It handled well during its flight trials and displayed remarkable fuel efficiency, but it was unable to reach the required top speed. Because of this, the Air Ministry quickly lost interest, but the Breguet design team insisted that they could get their aircraft to the speeds required, and this resulted in the improved Breguet 462. It was mostly similar to the 460, but the front of the fuselage was redesigned once again to be even more aerodynamic, and uprated engines of 940 horsepower were installed with variable pitch propellers. Armament included a forward-firing 20mm Hispano cannon and 2 rear machine guns for defense. It was intended that the 462 could now be used as either a bomber, a reconnaissance, or a ground attack aircraft, and it was submitted as an official entry into the Air Ministry's fast bomber requirement. First flying in the autumn of 1936, it achieved a top speed of 402 km per hour. Breguet had plans to install even more powerful engines to increase the speed even further, but they were never given this opportunity. Only 4 462s would ever be produced. One would be purchased by a Japanese delegation and shipped halfway across the world for assessment. Another, along with the prototype 460, would be sent to Republican Spain during the Civil War, and the 2 others were used mostly by Breguet as test beds. Considering that the other fast bombers being designed for the French Air Force, including the aforementioned MB.131, weren't going to be ready for at least another 2 years, this was a major blunder. The Breguet 462 could have been an excellent replacement for the current generation of bombers, including the Amiot 143. It was over 100 km an hour faster than the 143, it had an equal payload, and a better range. So why wasn't it ordered? Well, it was partly because the Air Ministry was being cautious, perhaps too cautious when it came to its funding, and didn't want to risk money on a design that might still turn out to be not very good, and partly because they had already committed themselves to another promising stopgap aircraft. But unfortunately, as it turned out, they would back the wrong horse. It is now that we come to the unofficial BCR contender, the atrocious Potez 540. This was probably the worst bombing aircraft to enter French service in the interwar period. Even the lumbering Amiot 143 had some redeeming qualities, but the Potez 540, though looking quite promising on paper, was completely rubbish when put into practice. This flying disappointment was the result of a private conversation between Henri Potez and Victor Denard, before the 1933 BCR specification was formally announced. Back in 1932, the French economy had finally felt the full effects of the Great Depression, and Denard was concerned about the future costs of the BCR program. Sensing an opportunity, Potez suggested that if Denard was willing to consider an unofficial entry, he would guarantee it would be cheaper. Denard agreed, and Potez designed and built the Potez 54 in just 4 months. First flying in November of 1933, it was an especially ugly blend of the old and the new. On the one hand, it featured a retractable undercarriage, fully enclosed cockpits, and shielded gun turrets. But on the other hand, there was little in the way of advanced hydraulics or electrical systems. The design featured a crude parasol wing, and the airframe was built using light and cheap materials, with much of the fuselage being made from wood and canvas, which surrounded a basic internal steel frame. To keep costs down, Potez ignored the use of any of the new experimental engines, and equipped the 54 with a pair of Hispano Suiza 12Xs, which produced just 690 horsepower. These were slung under the wing in a streamlined nacelle and attached to the fuselage by a small wing stub. Per the original BCR requirement, the Potez 54 would rely on gun turrets for defense. It had a bulky nose turret, a bulky dorsal turret, and a semi-retractable ventral turret. These were usually equipped with a single 7.5mm machine guns, though it does appear that sometimes these were replaced with twin pairs. Experiments were also carried out with the new 20mm cannons, but the turrets proved incompatible, and Potez deemed it too time-consuming and too expensive to upgrade them. With its crude construction, braced wing and low-slung engines, the Potez 54 was the least advanced of the aircraft submitted towards the BCR specification. But it was cheap, and its combination of speed, maneuverability, range, and bomb load meant that it came somewhat close to meeting the almost impossible BCR requirement. Because of this, it would be the Potez design that received a full production order. A second prototype, along with 43 production aircraft, were ordered as the Potez 540, and eventually almost 200 would be built as either the Potez 540 or the Lorraine-powered Potez 542. Entering service in late 1934, the Potez 540 finally put some new blood into the French bomber fleet, but unfortunately it proved to be completely rubbish. Despite having a modest loaded weight of just under 6 tons, the production version of the Potez 540 could barely manage 310 km an hour. It had a small bomb load of just under 1 ton, and it had a relatively short range of just 1,250 km. Additionally, though it was well protected by up to 5 machine guns, the manually operated turrets were prone to jamming, and they carried very little in the way of ammunition. Though it had been built for the 1933 BCR specification, the Potez 540 wasn't an upgrade when compared to the Amiot 143, which was built to the 1928 specification. Indeed, it could barely be called a side grade. The type was halfway to being obsolete before it had even entered service, and then its deficiencies were painfully highlighted during the type's combat debut during the Spanish Civil War. Though it was planned to provide up to 50 aircraft, only 14 of the Potez 540s would eventually be operated by Republican forces, and in hindsight they would be thankful, as the Potez would earn itself a particularly poor reputation. Spanish aircrews complained of cramped cabins, excessive engine noise, narrow sectors of defensive fire, little ammunition, unreliable carburetors, and an unacceptably poor speed of 270 km an hour when loaded with bombs. Slow, prone to fires, and easily damaged, it was soon nicknamed the Flying Coffin, and the French embarrassment continued when Spanish pilots then got their hands on the Soviet-built Tupolev SB. Comparing them side by side, it's remarkable that these two aircraft entered service at almost the same time. The Tupolev was a sleek, all-metal design that could achieve speeds of 450 km an hour, allowing it to outpace most of the fighters sent to intercept it. The Potez, by comparison, was an outdated hulk. And yet, outdated as it was, the Potez 540 would see service during the Second World War. Mercifully, not as a bomber, but as a trainer, transport, and occasionally as a reconnaissance aircraft. It was a fate shared by many of the BCR planes, including the Amiot 143, which still saw use as a night bomber during the war right up until the French capitulation. Back in 1934, the plan had been for these flawed designs to be no more than a stopgap, and they were all meant to be out of service completely by the end of 1939. However, by September 1939, the French would have less than 100 modern bombers in its air force, and its old, outdated aircraft were forced to struggle on. This begs the question, what had happened to the Air Force's expansion plan? And what had happened to the planned fast bomber, the machine that was meant to replace these old BCR aircraft in the first place? At the beginning, things started off rather well. In 1934, under Denard's Plan 1, the French Air Force was trending towards the development of more specialized aircraft, and the new bomber specification in particular looked very promising. Not only were there plans to develop a fast 5-man bomber, which, by the way, was soon amended to a 4-man crew, but an even faster 3-man light bomber was also being considered for the tactical support role. The army had finally begun to warm up to the idea of tactical bombing, courtesy of some rather eye-opening military exercises that had been carried out in the early 1930s. This would also be reinforced by experiences seen in the Spanish Civil War. And although the Maginot Line was still viewed as a key part of French military planning, the idea of more mobilized warfare was also being explored. This would require more support from the air, And so, for once, the Air Force's development of new bombing aircraft wasn't universally frowned upon. Not only was the new fast bomber concept a welcome departure from the BCR way of thinking, it also began a trend that saw a preference towards the radial engine when it came to bomber design. Up until this point, liquid-cooled engines had been preferred for their higher power and more streamlined shape. However, radial engines, though bulky, were now beginning to match the power of liquid-cooled engines. Streamlined cowlings were reducing their drag effect considerably. They had the advantage of being lighter, and they were far less susceptible to battle damage. This last point was of particular importance, as the range of bomber aircraft was steadily increasing, and the further you could go into enemy territory, the more survivable you wanted your aircraft to be. France was also being encouraged by the performance of radial engine aircraft being developed overseas, particularly in the United States. The Martin B-10, which had so surprised the French, used radial engines, and the United States, Japan, and Italy were all trending towards the use of radial engines as the power plant of choice for their frontline bombers. Thus, the French Air Ministry then stipulated that their new fast bomber must be powered by the radial engine as well, preferably with an output of at least 1,000 horsepower, which would allow a top speed of no less than 400 km an hour with a 1,200 kg bomb load. The plan was to have this new fast bomber in production by 1937, but this plan would be a failure, as by that year only a single prototype would even be available for testing, let alone entering full-scale production. And the reason for this was twofold. Firstly, the government failed to convey how lucrative the final production contracts could be. Only 4 companies submitted design proposals: Dewatin, Laticoere, Romano, and Liore et Olivier. Of these, only the latter had ever produced a successful long-range bomber. The traditional producers of bombing aircraft, Farman, Amiot, Breguet, and Bloch, were reluctant to abandon their current projects, particularly as the government had a reputation for not following through on large production orders. Secondly, but equally important, the current administration would be short-lived. A new government would take over, and aerial policy, and thus bombing policy, would shift yet again. By the summer of 1936, 2 years after the issuing of the fast bomber specification, and the year in which flight trials were meant to begin, only one manufacturer was close to having a prototype complete, and that was Liore et Olivier with their Leo 45. By this point, and for reasons we will discuss in a moment, other traditional bomber designers such as Amiot had also joined with their own proposals at last, but most of these were not even out of the testing phase by the time war would break out with Germany in 1939. Much of this was the result of events that occurred in 1935, 1936, and 1937, or as I like to call it, the 3 years of chaos, and it began with the French government's neglect of its aircraft industry. Now, as these events all directly influence the development of French bombers, we'll discuss the events first, and then take a look at the final generation of bombers that would emerge just before the outbreak of the Second World War. Following the official reveal of the German Luftwaffe in 1935, Victor Denard amended his expansion plan so that the French bombing fleet would more than double in size. This would begin with the order for 300 interim bombers immediately, a mix of existing Bloch MB.230s and Potez 540s, which at the time still looked promising, and it would then be followed by another order for at least 250 of the more modern fast bombers currently being developed. The entire expansion program was then accelerated, with most of the new fighters, reconnaissance aircraft, and bombers to be delivered by no less than mid-1936. These new contracts meant that the French aircraft industry was suddenly faced with the prospect of having to build 1,000 planes in the space of a year. The industry had been suffering in the French economy, and this new plan required production to increase by over 300% overnight. It was not a realistic goal, but Denard argued that it was just the sort of stimulus needed to kick the industry back into action and encourage faith from the manufacturers. Unfortunately for him, not everyone in Parliament approved of the plan. It was a gamble. It assumed that war would break out with Germany sooner rather than later. If there was no war, France would not be able to maintain this level of production, and the industry would be forced to contract once again. A period of indecision followed, where Prime Minister Pierre Laval held his fire. Then, in May 1935, France signed a pact with the Soviet Union, and this seemed to suggest that rearming wasn't such an urgent priority. Laval decided to suspend the proposed increase to the Air Force, and took it upon himself to decide when and how much funding should be released for the Air Force in the future. Eventually, some of the funding was released, but it wasn't even enough to satisfy some of the first orders that had been placed. Several contracts were cancelled, and this led to a complete breakdown of trust between aircraft manufacturers and the French government. Fast forward 6 months, and things get even worse. In January 1936, Laval was forced to resign, and a caretaker government took over, while the country prepared for a general election in the middle of the year. It was during this tumultuous time that France would have its first major confrontation with Hitler's Germany, the Rhineland crisis, an event which would have far-reaching effects on the French Air Force. Without going into too much detail, as the remilitarization of the Rhineland is a topic far beyond the scope of this video, one of the factors that influenced France's decision to not intervene was the state of its bombing force. Though they held an advantage on the ground and on the sea, the French were convinced that the Luftwaffe had an overwhelming advantage in long-range bombers. The German air industry was expanding rapidly, and surely many of Germany's modern all-metal airliners were being repurposed as bombers for the new Luftwaffe. The irony of the situation was that Hitler had zero intentions of using his bombers offensively at all, at least during this event. Like the French, he only wanted his bombers to deter attacks against Germany at this time. He too feared a knockout blow which might topple his young and still strengthening regime. Additionally, Hitler could no more afford to initiate a Douhet-style aerial war than the French could. The Dornier 17 and Heinkel 111 were barely entering production, and the bulk of Germany's bomber force was made up of the inferior Dornier 11 or 23s, or light bomber biplanes like the Heinkel HE-45 or HE-50. Indeed, during the Rhineland crisis, the French held the military advantage when it came to air power, though they did not know it. They had far more effective fighters in the form of the Dewoitine D-500 and the D-501, and if Hitler had not won his bluff and the French had intervened, he would have lost the real war that would have followed. In the wake of the Rhineland crisis, immediate steps were taken to raise the state of readiness of the existing bomber fleet of the French Air Force. All bomber groups were issued with targets that they should attack in the first 24 hours of a war with Germany. Bombing operations against tactical targets were not ruled out, but the Air Force was now far too preoccupied with a Douhet-style aerial battle against Germany, with the victor being the nation that could out-bomb the other. Though they did not know it, the French Air Force was now preparing for the wrong sort of war. Greater emphasis was now to be placed on using the bomber as a strategic weapon, with fighter and strike aircraft losing priority. Now the Luftwaffe, on the other hand, would shift to a focus on tactical bombing and army support, as part of the emerging Blitzkrieg doctrine. The French bomber policy was then reinforced in May 1936, when the Popular Front came to power in the election, and with it, Pierre Cot returned as Air Minister. Though he too had abandoned the BCR aircraft as a flawed concept, he still believed that strategic bombers were the primary means of waging an aerial war. Denain's expansion plan was revived and approved as Plan 2, however Cot planned a far more radical reorganization. The aim of the new plan was now to increase the bomb capacity of the entire bomber fleet to 850 tons by 1939. And to maximize the available aircraft for a single large engagement, the majority of Air Force squadrons would be centralized into 2 corps. The Light Defense Corps contained most of the fighter squadrons. It would be used to deal with enemy raids on French cities, or to protect the French army as needed. There would also be 10 regional fighter squadrons permanently defending targets in the rear. Meanwhile, all reconnaissance and observation units would be taken from the army, and they would join the bomber squadrons of the Heavy Defense Corps, which would be responsible for delivering the retaliatory strike. There was no questions of these being multi-purpose squadrons like they had been in the days of the BCR program. These reconnaissance and observation squadrons would be re-equipped with bombers like the Bloch MB.200 and the Amiot 143. To replace the units taken from the army, 26 short-range observation squadrons would be formed, with a further 17 to be added by the end of 1937. But these groups would be far smaller than their predecessors, each only possessing 6 reconnaissance planes and 3 of the new autogyros. And while these units were being produced, the army would essentially possess no aircraft at all aside from a handful of fighter squadrons. Kott's reasoning for this radical change was the defensive philosophy adopted by the army, symbolized by their reliance on the Maginot Line. It was claimed that the army was only ready for a defensive war, and Kott argued that it would be up to the Air Force to provide France's offensive punch. To say this proposal irritated several key officers in the army would have been an understatement, as Kott was essentially neutering their air arm. The army protested strongly, saying that Kott did not have the authority to impose his new organization on air units under their control. But the apparent weakness of the Air Force during the Rhineland crisis had left such a shattering impression on French politicians that they simply ignored the army's objections and approved Kott's proposals anyway. This coincided with another event which directly affected the expansion of France's bomber force, and that was the nationalisation of the aircraft industry. This was part of a broader scheme to nationalise the entirety of France's armament industry, and the 3 defence ministries of the Army, Navy and Air Force expropriated various manufacturing companies according to their own plans. Of the 3, the Air Ministry took the most extreme measures by far. Believing that most companies were underperforming, and that the expansion plan needed swift action, the ministry nationalised almost 80% of the aircraft industry. It bought out 66% of each company concerned, with the remaining share to be held by the previous private owner. These companies were then reorganised into regional groups known as Société Nationale de Construction Aéronautique, or SNCA for short. Initially, there were 5 regional groups named after their approximate geographical location within France. There was SNCA Centre, North, Southeast, Southwest, and West. Each of these regional groups absorbed most of the factories in its area, though a few did remain independent, and each had at least one facility located in or around Paris. Now, reorganising an entire industry wasn't something that could be done overnight, and the Air Ministry appreciated that there would be some disruption before things settled down. But with the consolidation of major production facilities, combined with a healthy injection of new funds, it was now hoped that the industry was now in a much better position to deal with the demand of the French Air Force's expansion plan. As it turned out, though, Pierre Kott's optimism was misplaced. By the end of 1937, the only bombers being delivered to the French Air Force were old designs, such as the Amiot 143 and the Potez 540. Just 2 modern designs were even close to entering production, the MB.131 and the Liore 45, while a whole string of other promising designs seemed to be helplessly stalled. Part of the problem was that many still feared that rearming too soon would be a mistake and needlessly cripple the French economy. When a new expansion plan was proposed in early 1937 to replace Plan 2, many ministers, including Pierre Kott himself, did not believe that France could afford it. He feared that the weak French economy, and the limited capacity of the industry, made the current target of Plan 2 the most the country could ever hope to achieve. Even then, Plan 2 was struggling. It required about 1,000 planes to be built per year, but this was soon reduced down to 700, and then down to 500, and even this would prove to be far too ambitious. The situation was becoming critical. While both Britain and Germany were striving to increase output, the number of warplanes being built in France was falling by the month. Opponents of the government blamed the program to nationalise the aircraft industry, but in reality this was not the case. Though there had been some disruption to the industry initially, most of this was now sorted, and the real problem was the inconsistent government procurement policy. Instead of ordering a substantial number of the best aircraft available, and this applied to all types, be it bombers, fighters, etc., the government instead always ordered small batches of different types to make up the same number. Companies tooled up for production runs that would only keep the factory busy for a few months, and then production would cease while preparations were made for the construction of an entirely different aircraft. This resulted in factories being inactive for weeks or months at a time as they modified their production lines. Even when larger orders were placed, they were divided between several different factories, which resulted in the same problem. A depressing example of this was the handling of an order for the Bloch MB.130, which was an updated version of the MB.200. This had been ordered as a stopgap in case other aircraft designs encountered delays, and it was a good job they did, because other aircraft had encountered delays. An order for 250 of these aircraft had been placed, and it could have been handled by either one or two very well-manned factories. But the government had so little trust in the industry that it spread this order across no less than 6 different manufacturers all over France. The problem was that there was now no trust at all between the government and aircraft manufacturers. The government didn't have the confidence to place large orders for a single design, in case it turned out to be the wrong choice and they'd wasted valuable funds, and the aircraft industry didn't have confidence in the government, which affected morale, productivity, and strangled innovative thinking. By the middle of 1937, Pierre Cot realized that things were falling apart incredibly quickly. And of course, the next thing he did was the thing that most politicians tended to do, and that was to cover his own arse. In a speech in June of 1937, he claimed that since he had taken over, the potential capacity of the aircraft industry had increased by 30%, production of modern planes was up by 100%, and the striking power of the French Air Force had been increased by 400%. In private meetings, he assured the French War Minister that although Britain was spending more money on its air force than France was, his nationalised industry was producing just as many aircraft. He also gave the impression that the lessons of the Spanish Civil War were being taken to heart, and that there was more cooperation becoming evident between the Air Force and the Army. France was now developing a bombing force that was equally as capable as striking enemy cities as it was to aiding her land army in the tactical support role. Of course, in reality, the state of things was quite a bit different. Firstly, the arrival of the first Bloch MB.210s and Farman F.420 heavy bombers had increased the potency of the bombing force, but much of the claimed increase in striking power had simply been achieved by just renaming reconnaissance squadrons as bomber squadrons, without actually changing the aircraft within. To put it bluntly, the French Air Force was stronger on paper, but not in reality. Secondly, France's capability to produce more aircraft had technically been increased, but only because existing factories had received new tooling equipment. Almost no new production lines had actually been set up, and although the new tools did allow aircraft to be built more efficiently, it did not equate to a huge increase in overall production. Additionally, Cot's claim to have doubled the production of modern planes very much depended on what you're defining as a modern plane. Apparently, the Potez 540 counted as modern in his eyes. To put it bluntly, France could produce more warplanes on paper, but not in reality. And thirdly, although some steps had been taken to develop aircraft capable of striking battlefield targets in the low-level support role, none of these were yet in service. In fact, most of them weren't even in the prototyping stage, and many of them never would be. Bomber squadrons were still equipped with aircraft that frontline commanders themselves had described as totally unsuitable for the role of battlefield support. So, once again, the French Air Force was capable on paper, but not in reality. It was this very reality that deeply distressed a British air attaché who attended the French Air Force's annual manoeuvres in 1937. There, he was treated to the alarming spectacle of large heavy bombers flying 100 feet above the ground in mock strafing runs in support of French troops. They performed their role with the grace of a mildly tranquilized swan, maneuvering so slowly that had it been a real battle, the enemy anti-air defences would have considered it a mercy to blow them out of the sky. Following this spectacle, the attaché submitted his findings to his superiors in London, who became equally alarmed at the state of their allies' air force. After Pierre Cot then turned down offers of British assistance, the alarm grew, and they decided to go over his head and take things directly to the French Prime Minister, Chaudhon. Having his gaffe blown by the British, Pierre Cot was then summoned for an explanation, and after several apparently brutal interviews, it was revealed to all that things were far from good. He was forced to admit that while Britain was producing up to 200 aircraft every month, and Germany was producing up to 300, France was only capable of producing 50, and even then that was an optimistic figure. Additionally, none of the French aircraft being built were considered modern, and in the matter of speed they were being thoroughly outclassed by their German rivals. The situation for the French was bad, and it was about to get worse. The discovery of the impotence of the French aircraft industry, and by extension the Air Force, also coincided with Mussolini's announcement of the Italian-German Axis. Now, France had two potential opponents to worry about in a future air war, and it did not have an air force or really much of an aircraft industry to cope with it. It was now time for some drastic action, and for once, the government actually took some drastic action. Plan 5 of the Air Force expansion program was laid out in March of 1938. It called for a frontline strength of 2,500 aircraft. This would include 500 twin-engine light and medium bombers, plus 200 dedicated strike aircraft and dive bombers. This plan included provisions to continue the development of the four-man fast bomber, which finally had several prototypes ready to go, and it laid out modified specifications for a three-man light bomber and a five-man heavy bomber. In the interest of keeping this video concise, and to prevent it from dragging on for far too long, we'll just cover the conventional bomber designs that were actually developed, and we'll focus on French dive bombers in another video altogether. When Plan 5 was introduced, the most modern bomber in the French Air Force was the Bloch MB.130, which I briefly mentioned earlier. And yeah, considering the British were now fielding things like the Vickers Wellington and the Hanley Page Hampton, and the Germans had the Heinkel HE-111, the Dornier 17, with the Junkers Ju-88 almost ready to go, things really weren't looking good for the French. The Germans had sleek, modern, fast, and capable bombers, while the French, well, they had weaponized greenhouses and what appeared to be a winged rubbish skip. Like its predecessor, the MB.210 was pretty much obsolete from the start. Entering service in late 1936, early 1937, it had a top speed of just 322 km an hour, and it could carry a bomb load of 1.6 tons. Between 250 to 300 of these lumbering machines were built between 1937 and 1939, and their sole purpose was to hold the ranks until a new generation of more modern French bombers could take their place. This new generation would feature the last bomber designs of the interwar period that would enter mainline production: the Amiot 354, the Bloch MB.131 and the MB.170, and the Liore 451. The French would also utilise some excellent multi-role aircraft, which could fit the role of a light or tactical support bomber as needed, and these were variants of the Breguet 691 and the Potez 630. But as they were not officially classified as bombers, we won't be covering them today. Having produced one of the world's ugliest bombers in the form of the Amiot 143, the Amiot design team redeemed itself, at least in the category of aesthetics, with the Amiot 354. It was one of the sleekest aircraft of its time, and this comes as no surprise as it was based on the Amiot 340. Unveiled at the Paris Air Show in 1936, it was ostensibly designed to be a high-speed racing aircraft capable of crossing the Atlantic. But with Amiot keenly aware of the growing need for France to rearm, This machine was also designed with potential military use in mind as well. Amiot's theory was correct. A prototype bomber variant was soon ordered, but it would not be until December of 1937 that it would fly for the first time. Without going into too much detail, as this bomber and the others we're about to discuss will get their own dedicated videos in the future, Amiot and the Air Ministry disagreed heavily on the aircraft's proposed crew, bomb load, and armament. The Air Ministry wanted a 5-man crew, a 1,500 kilo bomb load, defensive cannons in all stations, 1,100 horsepower Hispano-Suiza radials, and a top speed of at least 450 km per hour. Felix Amiot was horrified by this suggestion, arguing that fitting such potent defences would require changes to the fuselage, which would spoil its lines, and thus reduce streamlining, and additionally, Hispano-Suiza was encountering a lot of problems with the development of its latest radial engines, with Amiot much preferring to go with Gnome Rhone. After more than a year of arguing, testing, and then some more arguing, the result was a compromise, the Amiot 350 series, which began with the Amiot 351 that made its first flight in January of 1939. This was a medium bomber with a 4-man crew. It could carry a bomb load of 1,200 kilos. It was defended by a 7.5mm machine gun in the nose, another in the dorsal position, and it had a 20mm Hispano cannon to protect its vulnerable underbelly. It had a wingspan of 22.8 meters, a length of 14.5 meters, and a loaded weight of 11.3 tons. With a top speed exceeding 475 km an hour, and with a range of over 3,500 km, it promised to be a very effective and versatile bomber for the rapidly expanding Air Force. Unfortunately, the development of the Amiot was to be disastrous. Surprise, surprise. The French aero-engine industry, which had developed an excellent reputation for reliability during the interwar years, was suddenly encountering problems with its latest power plants. This led to testing delays, and forced Amiot to experiment with other power plant installations. The bomber was eventually tested with both radial and liquid-cooled engines from Hispano-Suiza, Gnome Rhone, Rolls-Royce, and even Pratt & Whitney. The other problem that delayed the development of this excellent bomber design was Felix Amiot himself. He had resented the nationalisation of his factories, and that is an understatement. He hated that the French government had taken his factories away from him, mostly because he believed that they had underpaid him for what they were worth, and cooperation between Amiot and the Air Ministry was hampered by his accusations that they were providing him with insufficient equipment, and their accusations that he was too busy trying to build new factory floor space rather than focusing on the production of aircraft. The result of this drama was that it wouldn't be until the spring of 1940, after war had been declared between Germany and France, and pretty much on the eve of the invasion of France by German forces, that the first Amiot bombers would even enter French Air Force service, by which point it was too little, too late. Putting aside the soap opera drama of the promising but disappointing Amiot, we'll continue with the Bloch MB.131 and MB.170. Predating Plan 5 by over 2 years, the 131 had taken the horribly outdated design of the 130 and transformed it into something vaguely usable. Operated as a medium-range reconnaissance bomber, approximately 143 or 145, sources do differ, of these aircraft were eventually built. The first prototype was flown in August of 1936, followed by a second in the following May. The main difference between the two was an increase in crew capacity from 3 to 4, reinforcements to the fuselage and tail, and adjustments to the locations of the defensive gun turrets. Following successful testing, the type was ordered into production, with the first units being delivered to the Air Force in the middle of 1938. Though it was an improvement on the previous bomber types, the 131 did stem from a design first drawn up in 1934, and because of this, its performance for 1938 was quite modest. It had a top speed of 349 km an hour, a range of 1,300 km, and it only had a bomb load of 800 kilos.
This made it more like a light bomber rather than a medium bomber, and it was decided that the 131 would be best used as an interim aircraft until a more modern reconnaissance bomber could take its place. Nevertheless, the MB.131 would still equip 7 reconnaissance groups by the outbreak of war with Germany. Its slow speed meant that it performed badly, and losses in the early months were horrific. The 131 was used for daylight missions, and this made it easy prey for the significantly faster Messerschmitt Bf-109. Its eventual replacement, the MB.170, was a much better performer. It was developed for a specification that called for a 2- or a 3-seat aircraft that could be used as a light bomber, a strike aircraft, or as a medium-range reconnaissance aircraft. The first prototype made its maiden flight on the 15th of February 1938. Compact and powered by a pair of 970 horsepower radial engines, its performance immediately impressed officials, attaining speeds in excess of 500 km per hour. After further testing, which included assessment of a highly modified second prototype, it was ordered into service as the MB.174. This was a sleek, compact, and fast machine that offered a near-perfect combination of firepower, protection, and speed. The MB.174 flew for the first time in July of 1939, and it ended service in March of 1940. It was probably the best bomber that the French had designed up until that point. It didn't have the heaviest payload, just 400 kilograms, but for light bombing and reconnaissance it was more than equal to its German counterparts. Its engines now produced 1,035 horsepower, and this, combined with refinements to the fuselage design, meant it could achieve speeds of up to 530 km per hour. This almost matched the top speed of the Bf-109E, and in fact, at lower altitudes, the MB.174 had a significantly faster cruising speed, which made it very difficult to intercept. Unfortunately, the 174's advantages over its German opponents was somewhat overshadowed by the fact that so few of them were in service by the spring of 1940 that they barely made a difference. When Germany began its invasion of France in May, less than 50 had reached operational status with frontline squadrons. Unlike many other units that suffered large casualties during this time, only 3 174s had been lost to enemy action by the time of the armistice, and most of the survivors had been evacuated to North Africa. The 174's excellent performance had made it almost impossible for German fighters to catch it, and had a few more been in service before the outbreak of war with Germany, it might have had a bit more of an impact. Unfortunately, once again, it was a case of too little, too late. If we're detecting a theme here, we would be correct, as this sentiment would also apply to another promising bomber that was developed in the late 1930s, and that was the LeO 451. Flight testing of the prototype LeO 45 had begun in January of 1937. At the time, it was driven by a pair of extremely powerful radial engines built by Hispano-Suiza, each producing 1,120 horsepower. With a simulated bomb load, the prototype was able to attain speeds of up to 480 km per hour, and it was estimated that a production aircraft would have a cruising speed of between 410 to 430. This put it on par, or even slightly ahead of the rumoured cruising speeds of the new German fighters, the competing Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Heinkel HE-112. And the Air Ministry immediately ordered it to be completed with military equipment for a full evaluation. This was soon followed by the order of 2 pre-production aircraft, which were designated as the LeO 450. This evaluation process began in late September of 1937, but it would not be until the spring of 1939, nearly 18 months later, that the first production aircraft would make its maiden flight. Like the Amiot 350, the LeO 45 suffered from serious engine problems. On the 6th of December 1937, both of the prototype's engines failed simultaneously, forcing it to a landing in a farmer's field, though thankfully the aircraft suffered no damage and was able to continue testing. Over the next 6 months, various attempts were then made to improve the engine's reliability and performance, but in August of 1938 everybody despaired and it was decided to abandon the Hispano-Suiza radial in favour of the Gnome 14N. Though slightly less powerful, they did not overheat on a mild spring day, and they didn't try to explode when you open the throttle. Along with the engine change, the aircraft had also received a few other modifications. It had a redesigned tail unit, new cooling radiators, and some slight improvements to the cockpit's instrument cluster. Because of this, the type was then redesignated as the LeO 451. Testing resumed in October of 1938, and despite having less powerful engines, the LeO 451 achieved an almost identical performance. By this point, the Air Ministry had already placed orders for the LeO 450, which were then put on hold due to the whole engine failing problem, and these orders were now converted over to the LeO 451, and they were increased as the threat of war increased in early 1939. By May of that year, there were almost 600 LeO 451s on order, which just a couple of years ago would have represented more than the entire allocated budget for the French bombing fleet. The production version of the LeO 451 that entered service was a little different from the prototypes, and again this was unfortunately due to problems in the French aero-engine industry. Owing to the failures of the Hispano-Suiza radial, huge demand was being placed on the Mistral Major engine instead, and supply was struggling to keep up with the demand. This led to production delays, but it also had a knock-on effect with manufacturers of propellers, and many of the LeO 451s were equipped with less efficient models which dropped their top speed. They were, however, still faster than the original LeO 45 prototype, as refinements in the design were beginning to yield top speeds in excess of 510 km per hour, but the production models would struggle to hit 490. Despite these little disappointments, and the delays, the French Air Force were optimistic about their new frontline bomber, as it met and exceeded the specification to which it had been built. They now had a 4-man medium bomber with a top speed of almost 500 km per hour, and it achieved this without sacrificing other capabilities. It could carry up to 1,500 kilograms of bombs. It had an impressive range of 2,900 kilometers, allowing it to strike deep into German or Italian territory if needed, and it was well defended, being equipped with 3 machine guns plus a 20mm Hispano cannon. By September 1939, there were a total of 749 LeO 451 aircraft on order. This included several different variants of the type, such as an envisioned high-altitude reconnaissance bomber, and a version powered by American engines to get around the shortage of French power plants. But despite these impressive numbers, which forecasted a huge swelling of the French Air Force, there were only 10 LeO 451 bombers actually in French air service, while another 22 were in the process of being delivered. Indeed, on the eve of the Second World War, fewer than 50 modern bombers of all types had been built, and only 17 were actually in the hands of French squadrons. The French also had 15 of the Potez 633, a light bomber version of the heavy fighter, which had originally been ordered by Romania and Greece but were then appropriated, which ironically meant that the most numerous modern bomber available to the French Air Force was the one that they hadn't even ordered. Instead, they had chosen to keep the Potez as a heavy fighter and as a strike aircraft, which, with hindsight, was definitely the right decision. Though the situation of the French bomber force was dire by the end of 1939, many felt that it was not completely hopeless. In the final months leading up to the war, the aircraft industry was finally getting its act together, and with a wartime economy thrown in, production was exploding at a rapid pace. By Christmas, major production lines were in place for multiple aircraft, and if they could buy just a bit more time, by the summer of 1940 around 1,000 modern bombers should be in the hands of the French Air Force. This meant that if the French could delay the decisive confrontation with Germany for just a little longer, and the production targets could be met, the French Air Force would be in a good position to challenge and respond to a Luftwaffe attack on French cities. But, as it turned out, the French Air Force had been preparing for the wrong war, which meant that even if it had a large bomber fleet, which it wouldn't have made much of a difference. The huge German bombing fleet that was prophesied to destroy Paris never materialized. Instead, German bombers operated close to the front lines, shadowing the army and providing tactical support. It was the perfect storm of poor planning, poor choices, and a healthy dose of poor luck. The French army, who at one point had shunned the very idea of even using bombers for tactical operations, had long since accepted the importance of strike aircraft and light bombers in a large ground campaign. But by that point, the Air Force had become independent, and the Army's ability to influence the composition of French aerial units had diminished. Meanwhile, the French Air Force, who had spent the better part of a decade under the Army's thumb, spent the better part of the next decade doubling down on a policy that saw strategic bombing as their key objective. This caused the development of fighter aircraft to lag behind, a failure which was then keenly felt during the Battle of France, where fighter aircraft and strike aircraft were of the most importance. And then, compounding the mistakes of both Army and Air Force, we had the French government, which changed almost every year. It failed to commit to large-scale expansion plans, it regularly cut down orders, and it was forced to nationalize and manage an embittered and hostile aircraft industry during a time when funding, efficiency, and goodwill was paramount. The result was chaos and defeat. But from the perspective of aircraft design, with the exception of the mediocre BCR aircraft, the majority of French bombers designed during the interwar years were quite good. Some, indeed, were excellent. Towards the end, France was even making some excellent headway towards producing multi-role aircraft that actually worked. After all, the sleek and fast Bloch MB.174 could perform most of the same roles that were expected of the lumbering Amiot 143 or the utterly useless Potez 540. It is therefore incorrect to say that the French bomber was an embarrassment during the Second World War. The real problem lay with policy, both within the Air Ministry and the government in general. But that is a discussion for another day. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters, many of whom voted on the topic of this special video. The source material for this video is practically identical to that of part 1, and you'll find links to the relevant books down below. Researching, writing, and most of all recording this glorious essay was a considerable challenge, and I may have lost my voice a little bit in the process, but I think I've done a pretty good job, and the feedback on the video thus far with part 1 has been amazing, so I'm really happy that people liked this discussion, and I'll do more stuff like this in the future. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier supporters. Now, with this mammoth task complete and out of the way, work is now continuing on the planned deep dive videos at a slightly faster pace, which I must say are a lot easier to produce than this, as it's a bit easier to talk about a single aircraft than it is to condense 2 decades of French aeronautical history into the span of a couple of hours. But what can I say, I have thoroughly loved the challenge. Until then, thank you all so much for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.